Boardroom Bound, episode 176, exploring the insight gained from 40 years of shaping the boardroom with Larry Siff.
It starts with, why do you want to have a board in the first place? So you as the CEO or owner, if you're thinking of having a board, you have to determine why do you want a board and what role do you want board members to play, right? Because board members effectively become the boss of the CEO when it's a board of directors. And then second of all, the process that you go through here is so important. It cannot be, I know someone who'll be good for your board.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Larry Siff. Larry is the founder and CEO of Neptune Advisors, as well as C-Level Community. And that means he is constantly engaging with C-suite people in the middle market and the boards of those companies, building them, reshaping them, connecting them, preparing them. And he has 40-ish years in the boardroom with hundreds of different organizations. He's going to bring all of those insights to bear on us today. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about board director education and certification. Want to join your first board or looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Education and Certification course. Get both the modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated with one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency designation upon course completion, available in one-on-one, group, or on-demand registration options. You can learn more at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/IBDC-D. So bit.ly/IBDC-D. And now, let's jump into the show. Larry Siff, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me here today.
Well, Larry, I'm delighted to have you on the show. You bring so much background experience, and you are constantly helping organizations, the management teams, and the boards to improve and to get better or to be established, all sorts of different parts in the process. So we're going to be able to talk through today, not only from the organizational side or as a whole unit, how the board gets together, but also as individual board members. But before we jump ahead and get into that, why don't you give us a bit of your career background and experience so that we understand how you got to be this person who's sort of helping, shaping, guiding, and forming boards today?
Sure. I mean, my original career started at Procter & Gamble. I was there for 5 years, and my claim to fame there was I started the wholesale club division for Procter & Gamble. And the wholesale club division, obviously, at the time, there was only Price Club on the West Coast, and BJ's hadn't even opened up here on the East Coast. So it was a major issue because they were concerned about it taking away from the grocery business. So I convinced them to do that, and today it's like $3.5–4 billion plus division within Procter & Gamble. And then after that, I ended up being president and CEO of a number of middle market companies, 7 in fact. My first was a family business, been started by my grandfather in 1930. My father ran it for 45 plus years. And I came in and I worked there, and I built it up from $15 to $65 million, and then ended up selling it off. I was the president and CEO, and I set up a lot of our operations overseas. We were designers, manufacturers, importers of men's, women's casual dress and rubber, golf footwear. I licensed McGregor for golf, and I set up in 9 countries, 38 factories overseas. So one point I was probably no longer a U.S. citizen. I'd spent so much time over in the Far East in particular. And then I ended up running a number of other companies over the years, and then I guess it's now almost 12 years ago, I started Neptune Advisors, and it's an advisory firm focused on middle market companies, how to take them to the next level of successful growth, and we take a very holistic approach to this. And then within Neptune, I started C-Level Community. And the whole idea of C-Level Community, again, is focused on middle market, but it's about connecting leaders and sharing industry best practices. And we have both online and offline components to that. We have online, we have experts every week, and I write a blog every week, and we do surveys related to the blog every week, and we have over 450 members of our community. And then offline, we bring the best CEOs from around the country. People think of people like the president and CEO of Marriott or the president and CEO of Birkenstock or any of these type of companies, all different varied companies and industries, and they get interviewed one-on-one by a Harvard Business School professor, and then we open it up to the business community to ask any questions they want. So they're an hour and a half, but they're really deep dive sessions. And then in terms of Neptune itself, we've had the privilege and opportunity of advising a lot of companies, all in the middle market, and boards. So I think I know we've now advised well over 350 companies, half family businesses, and a lot of boards. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Well, it leads us really well into the boardroom space where we're going to go today. Now, you've served on a ton of boards yourself, both for-profit and nonprofit. I know your first board role was in the nonprofit space, and it was pretty early in your career. So what led you down that path wanting to go and do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, it was really early, as now it seems a long time ago. So it was 1986, and I had been involved with an organization, a nonprofit organization called Boston Aid to the Blind. I had actually been a volunteer there, and I had an opportunity to serve on the board, so it was my first board experience. And then I also eventually became chair of the board, which was a whole different experience. So that was my first nonprofit board. Over the years, I tend to serve on 6 boards a year, 4 nonprofit and 2 for-profit, and I've also chaired 5 different boards now over the years.
And so we're going to get into a lot more from this, but if you look at that very first experience back in '86, what are some of the lessons you learned from that in terms of the boardroom?
Yes. I guess if I back up all the way to 1986, I was like, I consider myself a kid sitting on this board because a lot of the people in the room obviously had a lot more experience and expertise. One had chaired a local, very large accounting firm. So a lot for me was listening and learning, and then trying to better understand the role of the board and what we were trying to accomplish. And so it was I was really, I'd say in the 1980s, I was pretty much a sponge. I'm still a sponge today, but I was very much a sponge trying to understand, what's the role of the board and how we can, and what are we really trying to accomplish.
Well, we want to bridge some of that time from long ago back in the 80s to where we are today. So maybe you can just give some overarching thoughts. Can you tell us how much the role of boards has changed over the years?
Oh, yeah. Boards have changed dramatically over the years. So first of all, there's several types of boards. So on the one end, you have the passive rubber stamping board, and on the other hand, you have the extremely active, involved board. The rubber stamping boards are not boards that I tend to want and I won't get involved with. I just don't think that's a good use of time for a company or a CEO who wants to form a board and just wants people to say yes, yes, yes. I mean, that's not a good use. So the things that have changed over the years is obviously, and then besides the types of boards, the other is a board of advisors, there's a board of directors, and obviously board of advisors is different because of the advisory function of which the CEO or owner has the option of listening, not listening. If they're not listening, they shouldn't even have a board of advisors. And then you have board of directors that have fiduciary responsibilities. So if we focus on the board of directors with fiduciary responsibilities, and you're focusing them within that on the most active boards, the big difference that I've seen over years and years is how much more active the board has become. And the board plays a very different role than it used to years ago. So I think years ago, it was a lot led by the CEO or owner doing recommendations to the board. The board was considering it, going yes, no. Now I see you've not only got the quarterly board meetings, you've got the active committees, whether it's governance, nominating, compensation and benefits, any of those committees that are very active. So it's no longer just 4 meetings a year. You've got all the committee meetings where a lot of the work actually gets done. So that's been a big change. And then because board members have fiduciary responsibilities, they're now asking a lot more questions than they've ever asked in the past, and they're getting into a lot more areas than they've ever been into in the past. And that doesn't mean they don't understand their role, because, everyone knows the expression nose in, fingers out. It's not that the board is trying to ever run and operate on a day-to-day, but just understanding the governance and have we set up the proper processes? Do we really understand the risks? Those are all things that the board has to be responsible for today.
And so, Larry, let's stay at this sort of 30,000-foot view level, talk about the board as a whole. And obviously, we want to think about how do we become an effective board, right? How do we do that as an organization? So maybe what are the 2 or 3 most important attributes you would think for an effective board that allows them to add value back to the organization that they're serving?
Sure. So if you think about, as you said, the goal is to have an effective board, and you're asking what are the attributes of what? So I got to back up for a second here, because it starts with why do you want to have a board in the first place? So you as the CEO or owner, if you're thinking of having a board, you have to determine why do you want a board and what role do you want board members to play, right? Because board members effectively become the boss of the CEO when it's a board of directors. And then second of all, the process that you go through here is so important. It cannot be, I know someone who would be good for your board. It cannot be, I have a friend who would be good for your board. You have to start with your strategic business plan. And that business plan is not financial, so it's not just numbers. It's actually where do you want this company to be 5 to 10 years from now. So you start with that. And then you say, what are the skill sets ideally you need to have on your board for the next 5 to 10 years? Then the third part of that is then you identify candidates within the skill sets. So by doing this, you don't end up with everyone on the board who, quote, comes out of your industry. Or if you need help in doing acquisitions, you have no one with M&A, merger and acquisition experience. Or so you've now identified, if you want someone in cyber, IT, or whatever that is, you've now defined up front, these are the qualifications of what we're looking for. So then as board members, you have to be involved with the strategy of the company. And in fact, a lot of boards today, I would say, are co-owners with the CEO of the strategy. So gone are the days when the CEO presents the strategy to the board and the board says, yes, no, that sounds good. It's really being involved in understanding. So if you say it's a must, you must be very strategic and look at and understand the strategy and make sure you agree with the strategy that the CEO is taking on. So I would say that's number one. Number two is, as a board member, you have to make sure that you understand the critical factors and the risk factors for any company. And number three is you've got to decide, can you have an impact or not by serving on this board? Because if you can't have an impact, if you're not adding value, don't serve on the board. And again, I have seen, since we have not only been on boards over the years, I've also advised a lot of boards. I see some of these board members who have great names but may not be the best board members.
Now, Larry, there's a lot that we can go to from those statements. Those are incredibly valuable, but let's pick on one thing now, because the idea of long-term, even long-term investing, most people would say, I'm a long-term investor, and maybe they hold for a year, right, just to get long-term capital gains. When we talk long-term on the board and you're thinking about the strategy, you just said 5 or 10 years. I think many organizations and perhaps boards get sucked into this, perhaps probably focus too much on the short term. How can boards improve on that and make sure they're keeping their eye on the long-term horizon?
Right. Good question. So I believe that board meetings themselves should be 50% or more focus on strategy. And strategy I define as long-term strategy. So if you take a look at your agenda, and the agenda consists of all, three-quarters of it is reporting and three-quarters of financial reporting, you're not using the board to the best of the ability. So the way I look at it is you've got to make sure that the agenda itself for the board meeting is set up so that 50% or more of the time is spent on strategic issues. So one of the things we advise the CEOs is when you're presenting to the board, first send a one-pager in advance of the board meeting and identify these are the 2 or 3 issues that you're struggling with. Maybe it's 3 to 5 issues. And give your recommendations in terms of being the CEO of the company, but then have a discussion with the board and get their input. Because if you leave the meeting as the CEO or as the owner and said, I just spent weeks prepping for this board meeting, and we just had a 4-hour or sometimes full-day board meetings, and I didn't get much out of it, there's a problem. There's an issue right there. So, and then the key is, as I said, is focus on long-term, not short-term. And it's so easy, and I know it. I've been CEO of 7 companies to get caught up in the day-to-day and day-to-day operations or putting out the fires. But you as CEO have to make sure you also are focusing on long-term strategy. Where do you want to take this company 5 or 10 years from now? And you have to make sure that you're spending your time on these long-term strategic issues.
So, Larry, why don't we pivot just a little bit here to also think about the responsibility of the board members to make sure that that goes really, and you have a good conversation. So, and I know we can talk about this in depth, and I'd love your thoughts on it. Clearly, you need everyone around the room to have done their homework, right? They need to get the material far enough in advance. They need to digest it. The last thing you want to do is spend that 4-hour board meeting going through slide presentations. You want to be able to come and ask questions and add value, and you're doing advising for boards. I'm sure some of the opportunities you walk into are probably not exactly as effective as this. Help us understand the scenario. What's the ideal one, and how do you help organizations get to that sort of best functioning boardroom?
Sure. So we get very involved in this, and we've been involved in this with a number of boards. First, a couple of the comments you made are absolutely correct. Materials have to be provided in advance. Define what that means. We've seen boards that literally they were emailing the board while they were flying out to the board meeting, the materials. That's inexcusable. So it's got to be minimum of 5 business days before the board meeting. You've got to give the board the time to read and absorb the information. So it has to be done. Number 2 is the board member responsibility is to have read the information. And it is very obvious when they start asking questions that are answered 3 slides later or 5 slides later, right? So that's also very important. In terms of the presentation, dog and pony shows are totally worthless.
Right.
And there's too many of them. And part of the issue is the CEO wants to make sure they recognize certain executives. And so they have them get up there, and a number of them read the slides. And we have seen this in the hundreds of boards we've advised where we sit there and the person is literally reading the slide. Assume the board, so we back up and we do 2 things. 1, we interview each of the board members. We have their bios in advance. We look at their skill sets and we ask them, do you believe that this company is using you to the best of your ability? And we've done actually individual surveys, and most of them say no, like 80-something%. So you've got an issue right there. You've got them sitting there attending board meetings, whether it be a Zoom person, and they're not being used to the best of their abilities, right? So we do individual interviews with the board members trying to say, why do you serve on the board? What do you intend to get out? The objectives, what would you like done differently? And we do the same thing with the management team. And typically what happens is the management team is spending way too much time. In fact, we've gone through and reduced the time they spend in preparing for board meetings by more than half. And the board members aren't getting what they need. So back up to that presentation. Instead of going through slide-by-slide presentations, what we've done is we've coached now the senior management how to present to the board. And we say the same thing to them, similar to CEO. What are the 2 or 3 questions or issues you want to address in your 25 slides with the board? And all of a sudden they say, well, I'd like to get input on this. Okay, that's what you need to do. Don't just sit there going through 20 or 30 slides. The other thing we have done and recommend is pull financials out of some of the board meetings. So for some of the boards we advise, they're now doing a meeting a week before just covering all the numbers and the financials. Because often what happens is the board spends so much time on the financials, they don't get to the key issues. And that's the other thing. The critical issues, the 2 or 3 or 3 to 5 that you have identified, are what you need to be discussing at the board meeting. If you put them at the end of the agenda, which often happens, by the way, and say, oh, we really didn't have enough time to discuss this, or let's set up another meeting, that's another issue. So, again, strategy and being strategic and focusing on long-term is the way the CEO is doing it, the way the board's doing it, and then the interaction between the two.
So let me sort of change gears a little bit here, Larry, and it'll be related to this because I'll call this sort of due diligence, onboarding, however we want to think about it. But when someone is trying to land a board seat and a board is looking for the new board member to bring on, you need to make sure it's a match, not only background and experience, but the culture and how that's going to work. Now, as a prospective board member, you want to go into a high-functioning organization where you can add value, hopefully not be that flustered board member if they don't really use me the way they could. In the same way, the board needs to be very careful to make sure they bring on someone who has the background experience that they need, but also will be a fit, will do their homework would be one example of that. And I'm sure you've seen situations where it hasn't been a good match, and you're beginning to talk about that here. So give us a sense, because many people listening to the show are thinking, I want to land a board, and they want to put themselves in a good position, a good place. How do both sides need to think about this dance to figure out whether it's the right person to go forward with?
Well, you pointed out a good, and part of what you were just saying, you pointed out a really good point, fit. It comes down to fit. It's not always going to be the right fit, and you have to determine that. So someone can look great on paper, on their resume. They may not be the right employee example for your company, even though on paper they look great. Well, it's the same as the board. And you also pointed out, which is key, is when you're being interviewed for a board, it's the interviewer and the interviewee. It's both ways, right? So if I'm being interviewed for a potential board, I have questions I want to know about serving on the board, and vice versa. And then both have to do the due diligence on both ends. Check me out, see how I have been, if I contributed or not to other boards I've been on, and vice versa. Talk to other existing members of the board as well as past members of the board, and find out what is it really like to serve in this board. So knowing up front, what are the time requirements of the board? Do you feel like the board is being really strategic or not? So understanding all that. In terms of onboarding, I have seen boards of directors thrown into the fire, and they sit there in board meetings. It's their first board meeting, and they haven't been even properly educated about the company. And that can range everything from the governance to, the processes and procedures, the organization, minutes of past meetings. Provide that new board member as much information in advance as you can. Take them through a tour of the facilities. Obviously, if it's overseas, it becomes more challenging, but take them through the headquarters. Have them meet with all the key management. And then when they are identified, yes, they're definitely coming on board, they're joining the board, give them a mentor on the board, someone they can go to and say, hey, these are the questions I had, or I didn't know what we were talking about. But to throw someone in, meeting one, who doesn't know anything about, or knows very little, I guess, about the company itself, the organization, the governance, the past board meetings, the past committee meetings, and you throw them in day one, and then they sit there and they don't know what the board is talking about in a number of issues, and nor do they know who they can go to. So I'm a big fan of, besides having a new director, have a mentor, someone that new director can go to and say, these are the questions I have I'd like to get answered.
And I'm often shocked at how many boards fall down in the onboarding process after they spent all that time and energy to find what they thought was the right person. And Larry, many people listening to this are going, okay, this is great, this is invaluable. How do I be that person? How do I put my best foot forward? How do I be the tallest duck in the pond? How do I stand out? In your role where you're advising and you're coaching and you're helping shape different boards, I'd love to know your thoughts on maybe, say, characteristics that are important to be a strong board member. And I don't necessarily mean specific skills or expertise, but rather attributes that might cut across all industries or sectors.
Well, again, it's very dependent on the board itself, the company, and what they're actually looking for in terms of that, and whether your own skill sets match up with what they're looking for. So if you get back to what I talked about, if they know this is our strategic business plan, this is our long-term plan, and these are the qualifications, and you meet them, then you've got to determine do you actually meet them or not? Yes or no? And is this a board you would want to serve on, and they in turn would want you part of the board? And so, obviously you've got integrity and all the there's the soft and then there's the hard skills within it. But it's also in terms of you in deciding, can you add value to this company, to this board by serving on it? And if the answer is no, don't do it. The other thing is you have to understand, and this is another key thing for boards, is what hat you're wearing. So we obviously deal with this a lot, with whether it's a CEO or past CEO who joins a board, or whether it's a family member serving on a board, understanding in the boardroom that you are wearing your board of directors hat. You're not in the boardroom because you're an owner, because you have some shares in the company. You're not in the boardroom because you're a family member. You're not in the boardroom because you knew XYZ who got you on the board. You, in fact, are in there because you're a board director and need to act like a board director when you're in the room. And your fiduciary responsibility is no different than anybody else who serves on that board.
And Larry, I want to make sure we talk a little bit about being a board chair, because it has a little bit of different expectations and responsibilities than just being a board member. And some people want to grow and develop from now they've landed the board seat to being a good chair. And that has a lot of different parts of it, from facing off to management, and certainly the CEO, to perhaps coaching and perhaps helping some board members perhaps improve if they haven't been doing their best. What is the ideal board chair? How do you sort of guide people to become the best that they can be in that specific role?
Right. The board chair is a whole different position than the rest of the board, because the board chair is responsible for setting the tone of the board, for making sure all the meetings are setting up, to making sure the evaluations take place annually, both the evaluations of the CEO and the board. And the board chair has to make sure that everything is getting done. Is the strategy getting done? Do we have the audit committee meeting and doing the appropriate things? Are we considering the key issues out there when it comes to cyber? Are we bringing in outside expertise when we need to? Are we focusing enough on the long term? Are we, making sure that, the strategic plan really is getting actually implemented on the ground by the management? Is the financial management, are we doing the right things there from an audit committee and governance committee things? Have we covered succession planning? The what if hit by a bus, if our CEO is hit by a bus, who's going to take over? Have we done what we need to do? That ultimately all comes down to the board chair. The other thing is when there's issues at the company, there could be a major personnel issue that happen or something. The CEO will often notify the board chair immediately on issues like this, and then the board chair has to decide that is this something that's appropriately discussed by the entire board or not. So they're actually the conduit The other thing board chairs need to do is have a weekly call, typically with the CEO. So often the best CEOs out there have monthly calls with the board besides the the quarterly board meetings and everything and all the committee work. They also typically will have a once-a-week meeting with it. So it's a different level of roles and responsibility. It's a much different level of commitment in terms of time being a chair.
Well, Larry, we have covered so much today, and we've been exhaustive in a very short period of time. And as I think about sort of a takeaway from our audience, I would love your thoughts on this, because I know you help organizations figure out maybe sometimes how to replace a board member, or you're building a board from scratch. So you're helping them. And I've heard your advice that, ideally you'd want someone who has experience, but when you get that whole conundrum of how do I get a job that experience, how to experience that a job. So someone's got to get their first board role to be ready for the boardroom. And I know you're bent, and I understand why, would be to take someone who's been there and done it before. But sometimes you will pick someone who is the right person for the job, even though they haven't been in the boardroom before. So I'm sure there's some people listening going, hey, that's me, I'm ready for the board space. How does someone get that across in their candidacy so that the person on the other side doing the interviewing says, yep, you are ready to go?
So, So the first is you've got to have a very strong reputation in the marketplace, and then you look at how a lot of these boards are picking new candidates for the boards. It could be, an existing member of a board who wants to recommend you. It could be it's a service provider. I know a law firm and the lawyer said I'd be great for this, right? So you could get in. So assuming the board has gone through, they've defined these are the skill sets I need for the next 5 to 10 years, and you meet one of those skill sets. Often, unless the board has hired one of the major recruiting firms out there for particular board members, which you could have your resume obviously at. The other way to go about it is that you've got the relationships with the service providers who then are going to recommend you for a particular board. So that's a way to get on, number one. And number two is, I would say it is a lot easier to get on a nonprofit board than a for-profit board. So a lot of the nonprofit boards are constantly looking for new board members out there. Get on a nonprofit board as your first board. You will learn so much just in terms of governance and risks. And it is different than a for-profit board, but it will give you experience. So I would say number one is get on a nonprofit board. And then understand very clearly if you can package yourself, your bio, so that it would appeal to particular boards as they look forward.
Well, Larry, we appreciate you sharing your, I would call it probably thousands of hours and hundreds of boards of experiences with us today. We were delighted to have you on the show. We appreciate you sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Larry Siff, and it was amazing to think that nearly 40 years in the boardroom, serves on 6 boards a year, advises hundreds of them, and all the different board members he has coached and shaped and developed and grown. And we could hear all that coming through in the very simple but insightful answers we got today. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you'll find links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you miss any of the high-quality content we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.